Okay, good morning and very warm welcome to everyone that has joined us today. Thank you for giving us some of your time this morning. My name is Amina Buba Shagaya and I will be moderating this webinar, this session. If I could get people to just introduce themselves and say where they're from in the chat box, that would be great. I'll give you about a minute to do. First things first, sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I mean, we can.
So I'll just give about a minute for people to introduce themselves and tell us where they're joining from, just so that we know how wide our network has reached or how wide our reach is. Good morning, Becca. Good morning, Jörg. I hope I pronounced it properly, from Austria. Good morning, Damir from Serbia. Good morning, Boma. Good morning, Nadu. Good morning, Julius. Okay, so while everyone is introducing themselves and telling us where they're from in the chat, I will introduce myself as the moderator. Again, my name is Amina Buba Shagaya, and I'll be the moderator for this session. I am a sustainability and ML expert. I work with Reframe and Inc. I specialize in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I'm also a project manager and energy expert. So it's a genuine pleasure to be holding this space for what I know will be a substantive and timely conversation. So we're here for the third episode of MudoZangl's Deep Dive Series, and it's going to be an intensive series of expert-led conversations or sessions designed to move beyond just the surface level discussion and get into the mechanics of what's actually changing in how industries manage risk, data, and governance. Today's episode is titled From Compliance to Capital Discipline, Mastering Emissions Governance for Institutional Resilience. So I want to say upfront that this is not just a conversation about sustainability in the traditional sense. It's a conversation about institutional design, financial credibility, and the data infrastructure and how that sits at at the heart of capital access now. It's the era of carbon, sort of that reporting checkbox, we believe is over. It's not just about ticking boxes to say, we've done this or we've complied with this. It's now what replaces that we want to hold these sessions about and unpack further. So before we dive in, I'm going to introduce the three exceptional speakers that we have today that will be guiding us through the next 90 minutes. Our first speaker is named Tosin Leye Odeyemi. She is the head of Holdco, Risk Capital Management and Sustainability at Stanbic IBTC Holdings, PLC. And she also serves as a non-executive director on the board of Stanbic IBTC Trustees Limited. Her bio is on the screen. Tosin brings over 2 decades of experience in governance, capital management, and sustainability. And she's, having led across internal control, compliance, investment management, finance, and people and culture since joining Stanbic IBTC Group in 2002. In her current role, she drives governance operational efficiency, and value-led decision-making across risk and sustainability functions. She is a fellow of ICANN, and she's an FSA credential holder. She holds an executive MBA from Lagos Business School and was appointed in November 2025 as the chair of the technical committee of the Pan-African ESG Forum. So this is a lot of, these are a lot of accolades that Tosin has. So she will be opening our content sessions by taking us through emissions management through finance and risk lens. Yeah, so I think we should give her a really warm welcome. I'm going to just introduce everyone first, and then I'll hand over to Tosin to start to kick off the sessions. The second speaker is Dr. James. If we can pull up yes, Dr. James Ogunleye. So beside it, as you can see, we have the PhD MSc B Engineering. He's a managing director and the CEO of Carbon Limits Nigeria. And he's a climate and energy expert with over 20 years of experience across energy systems, climate policy, and low carbon project development across Africa. So not just Nigeria. Dr. Ogunleye's work spans carbon markets, gas flare reduction, methane mitigation, and carbon credit project development. He has served as the lead consultant on Nigeria's MRV framework. He's contributed to the development of Nigeria's NDC registry, and he's led registration and monetization of some of Nigeria's most significant CDM projects, including the largest CDM project in the country. So he also advises governments, regulators, private sector across Africa on climate policy and carbon market participation. Dr. Ogunleye will challenge us on what carbon credibility really means and what it costs institutions that don't have it. So last but not least, our third speaker is Alexander Mirkovic. I hope I pronounced it properly. He's a digital transformation engineer and a GHG, which is greenhouse gas specialist at MudoZangl. Alexander is an oil and gas professional with a rare combination of expertise in petroleum engineering, software development, and technical product management. So in his role, he designs and architects scalable GHG emissions accounting software, builds customized dashboards for emissions KPIs, and translates complex business processes into automated, defensible data systems. His prior experience includes reservoir engineering at Gazprom, Neft Scientific Center, and digital technologies engineering at PM Lucas, where he developed automated systems for stationary combustion greenhouse gas emission estimation. He holds a master's in petroleum engineering from the Technical University of Crete and advanced studies in data analytics from the University of Belgrade. Alexander will close our content session by showing us, what it actually looks like to architect Scope 3 intelligence at scale. So, I think he will also explain Scope 3 during his session as well. So just a quick one, if you can return to the agenda slide, just to say how our 90 minutes will flow. We have about 70 minutes of content across the three focus presentations. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will have a dedicated 20 minutes for Q&A, time permitting, with all the three speakers. And then we will close with some brief industry reflections. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentations. And if you have a question, just drop it into the chat box, raise your hand, and then we'll be pulling them together for the Q&A session. So we'll do our best to go through as many questions as the time allows. And yeah, so with that, we can get into it. And Tosin, I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. So today I'll be sharing perspectives on how emissions management must evolve, viewed through a finance and risk lens to ensure that our organizations are not just reporting, but that we're making the right decisions. On the content slide, I'll just run through quickly what we'll be discussing. So today I'll be taking us through what I see as a critical shift that is quietly but fundamentally reshaping how institutions must move from fragmented emissions reporting to the full enterprise governance conversation. We'll start by unpacking why this topic matters now, where most organizations are still getting it wrong. Then I'll walk us through the structural shifts driving this change, particularly how emissions is moved from sustainability concern into a risk and capital issue. From there, we'll explore what enterprise governance looks like in practice, what leading institutions are doing differently, and the practical steps that we require to get there. And then I'll close by challenging us to reflect honestly on where we are today. What needs to change if we are to remain relevant? I'll move through the slides efficiently and I'll take questions in line with the agenda. So on the next slide, let me start with a simple but uncomfortable statement. Emissions is no longer a sustainability metric. It is now a financial variable. And the real question for all of us in the room today is, who actually owns emissions in the organization? Is it sustainability? Is it risk? Is it finance? Or no one in a way that truly drives decisions? Because where this sits determines whether you're reporting risk or you're managing it. On the next slide, let's talk about why this conversation that we're having, why it's important right now. It's no longer a theoretical conversation. We're seeing three things happen simultaneously. First, IFRS S2 is pulling emissions into financial disclosures. Second, investors are increasingly pricing transition risk. And third, regulators are moving from guidance to supervisory expectation. And for financial institutions, this is even more critical. Financed emissions are no longer abstract. They are actual balance sheet exposures. So whether we are ready or not, carbon has entered into the balance sheet. On the next slide, we'll look at what fragmented reporting looks like. So despite this shift, most organizations are still reporting in a fragmented model. The ESG team owns disclosure. Finance owns the numbers. Risk is not fully cited on the exposure. And the business continues largely unchanged. What we end up with are parallel systems and not an integrated view. We'll then look at what are the symptoms of fragmentation on the next slide. So when you have a fragmented system, you have multiple reports. There's no single source of truth. Scope 3 is based on broad estimates with limited confidence in that information. And most importantly, there's no linkage to decisions. It's not influencing credit. It's not influencing capital allocation. It's not shaping strategy. These are clear symptoms of a system that is not integrated. On the next slide, we look at what the core failure is for our organizations. So the core issue is not that we're not measuring emissions, it's that we're not governing them. We've built in the reporting capability, we have our systems, whether it's tech or it's not tech, whether you're using Excel, but you have that reporting capability built into your system. But what you have not built in as an organization is the decision capability. So you're reporting, but it's not influencing anything. On the next slide, we look at why fragmentation is dangerous. And this is where it becomes a finance and risk issue. Fragmentation leads to mispriced risk. It increases the organization's regulatory exposure. It creates a greenwashing vulnerability. And more importantly, it creates strategic blind spots for the organizations. So if emissions are not integrated into your cost systems, your view of risk is fundamentally incomplete. I will now briefly highlight 4 irreversible shifts that organizations need to understand and position for. On the next slide, we look at the first shift. Emissions is now a capital discipline. It is influencing credit approvals. It is influencing exposure limits. It is influencing sector strategies. So it's no longer about reporting performance. This is now about influencing where your capital goes. Carbon is now underwriting our input. The second shift is around scope 3. For financial institutions, scope 3 represents financed emissions, which means that it is directly linked to the portfolio risk of the organization. However, the challenge remains. Data is incomplete. Methodologies are still evolving. This is a very nascent area for organizations. And estimation uncertainty is very high. So if your scope 3 is opaque, then your portfolio risk is automatically opaque. So it's important that as organizations, we get a good handle on the scope 3 conversation because it is directly linked to the portfolio risk of the organization. The third shift is convergence. And we are moving from multiple voluntary frameworks to more standardized and enforced disclosures. IFRS 2 is the major step in this conversation, and the implication is clear for us. We are moving from narrative reporting to auditable finance-grade disclosures. We have the IFRS S1 and S2 timeline roadmap in Nigeria, and mandatory reporting will start in 2028. This is moving us into standardized and enforceable disclosure. That is the third shift. The fourth shift is governance. The conversation is moving upstream. From sustainability teams is moving to executive leadership and to our boards. Risk committees are now engaged. Finance is now engaged. And governance has moved from the CSR desk. It's moved to the CRO's desk. So let's look at the old versus the new world. What transition are we seeing? We're moving from ESG reporting to financial disclosure. Moving from sustainability-led to enterprise-owned. We're no longer backward-looking, we're forward-looking. And we're moving from a narrative conversation to quantitable and auditable disclosure. This is not a structural shift. This is a structural shift, actually. It is not an incremental one. So it's important that we understand that it is something that is going to cause organizations to leave their comfort zone and move into the new world. So what do organizations need to do to move along this continuum? Let's look at the next slide. Organizations now need to move from reporting to measurement. From measuring, they need to move to integration. From integrating, they need to move to governance. And from there, it has to be embedded in decision-making. However, a lot of organizations are still stuck on the first two stages. We're still doing reporting and measurements. We're yet to integrate, we're yet to drive governance, we're yet to integrate the information that we have into our decision-making. So recognizing this gap is the first step to closing it. So what really does enterprise governance mean? What does it mean for your organization? When we say enterprise governance, we're not talking about creating another committee. We're talking about embedding emissions across finance, across risk, across strategy, and into the business teams. This is not a function conversation. It is you creating the right system that works. So let's look at governance architecture. At a practical level, the board will provide oversight. The executive teams would own the delivery, but risk integrates emissions into the finance frameworks. Business units will execute, and without clear ownership, then governance would fail. So it's important that the board will stay at the oversight level, allow executive ownership, and then would have the risk integrating the finance emissions into decision-making and clear accountability happens across board. So let's look at our data and the infrastructure that we need to put into place. So underpinning all of this is our data. Our source systems must be reliable, methodologies must be consistent, and controls must be auditable. This is so critical because if the data is weak, then our governance will be cosmetic. So how do we then integrate this into our core decisions? That is, for me, the real test of maturity. Where does emissions show up in our decision making? Is it in your credit committees? Is it in the capital allocation stage? Is it in your portfolio strategy? If it's not showing up in those places, then you're not yet at that governance maturity level. On the next slide, I show us what the operating model maturity curve looks like. You have to move from ESG reporting to measurement. And then the next stage will be that we'll move from ESG reporting, you move to measurement, you move to partial integration, is a step by step. But the real shift is happening at enterprise governance. Ultimately, you then embed it into your decision making. So the real question for us this morning is, where is your organization? Where are we on this operating model maturity curve? Are you still at ESG reporting? Are you doing the right measurements? Have you started partial integration into your systems? Are you at enterprise governance level? And where is this conversation showing up in your decision making? So what does good look like? When you look at leading institutions, you see a few things that are consistent for them. Emissions is integrated into the credit models for the financial institutions. It is informing the sector limits that the financial institutions are using to take decisions. And it is even embedded in the stress testing of the organization. And at the board level, this is a standing agenda topic. That is what good looks like. So how do we get there? So on the next slide, I show us what the implementation roadmap should look like. The first phase is to stabilize your data and your methodology. Clean up your data. Align your reporting. The second phase is to integrate it into your risk and finance systems. The third phase is to optimize through scenario analysis and portfolio steering. Most organizations underestimate that integration conversation because that's where the real work sits. What are the common pitfalls you need to avoid as an organization? Don't treat this as an ESG project. That's not your next ESG project. And then don't over rely on proxies. It's important that you're owning. So another common pitfall is that executive ownership. There has to be that tone from the top. And then weak data governance is also a very common pitfall. Any one of these pitfalls will derail the progress of the organization. On the flip side, what are the critical success factors? The first is that you need to have a strong CFO and the CRO alignments. The chief financial officer and the chief risk officer of the organization have to be strongly aligned. You have to have robust data governance. You have to put in place the controls, the guardrails. You have to have active board engagement. The board has to be asking the difficult questions of management, and there has to be clear accountability. Without this, progress is going to fail. So what is our strategic reality at this point? Institutions that treat emissions as reporting will fall behind. Those that treat it as risk will survive. However, those that treat emissions as capital are those that will lead. So let me leave us with 3 questions. Who owns emissions in your organization? Is it influencing your decision making? If your regulators come in and they review you, what will break? That is the real test. In closing, like Amina opened up the discussion this morning, this conversation is not about sustainability maturity. It's about our financial systems being ready. And organizations that understand this very early and realize that there has to be alignments, emissions is not just about measurements. Those emissions data that you have, it has to influence your data governance. It has to influence your decision making. It has to influence where capital flows to in your organization. And there has to be strong alignment. You have to move to ensure that your data is strong. Your methodologies are consistent. Treating emissions as reporting will not lead you to the next level. You have to ensure that you are pricing it into the risk conversation of the organization. And it is those organizations that understand this very early that will define the next phase of our markets. Is emissions showing up in your scenario analysis as a financial institution? Is it driving the portfolio steering of the organization? Those are the conversations that have to start happening. And that way you move from a fragmented reporting position and move into full enterprise governance. I will pause at this time and I'll hand over back to Amina to moderate the rest of the conversation. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tosin. And, I think that's the end where we've said it's not about sustainability maturity, it's about financial systems readiness. I think for a lot of us in organizations, we have to start thinking of that shift and the fact that it's not just checkboxing anymore. It's not just a tick to say that we've crossed this off and we're good to go. So thank you so much for that powerful session. Again, like I said, we'll do the Q&A afterwards, but without further ado, I want to hand over to Dr. James to take the floor for his own session. Thank you, Dr. James.
Yeah, thank you. Amina, appreciate. Let me also say thanks to Tosin for a very good job. Thank you for those presentations. I think for those slides, looking at the slides, they're very catchy and interesting. And I think you put the story right and quite touch on how we've moved indeed to how and why we need to move from fragmented reporting to enterprise governance. So what I'm going to do in this, if you look at the next slide where my content is, just sort of give an overview, sort of background, then look at the early stages of how emission reporting has evolved, how that started in the early stages. What are the changes that's noticeable at this time? And I'm not going to dwell so much on the effect on capital allocation because I thought TT has actually, Tosin had actually touched on that. And then I'll go ahead and conclude. But one of the things that I want to sandwich this presentation with is to give an example, practical example of fragmented reporting and indeed what the costs implication of not having this right, how that has been in the past. Of course, historically, in terms of data collection, it's not necessarily for emission management. 20 years ago, when I started in this industry, you go in there, ask for data, and then you can see quite clearly that data are collected majorly for operational reasons and perhaps regulatory purposes, which is even secondary. I think mostly it's on operational reasons. And you see, over time, there's a very big pressure globally and local pressure to try and manage and report greenhouse gas emissions. The conversation was not same some years ago, but the point is that wherever the conversation is, the reality is that the impact of emissions on the industry is now getting clearer and people getting to know more about what this is. We're moving and we're transiting from that unstructured reporting to now people looking at things from the company-wide emission management. It's, as Tosin rightly mentioned, we're not there yet, but you're beginning to see some movement in terms of looking at emissions from company-wide emissions management. So if you go to the next slide, some of the early stages of emission reporting that you see is that you have reports that people do based on environmental incidents, where you have issues on the sites or from the facility. Then you jump in there and then people ask for reports. If a regulator is coming, then you go in there, there's a report that comes out. Or even for operational events and also for specific reporting requirements. Rarely would you have people just for the purpose of emissions. As a matter of fact, if you pick an example of a power industry who cares about the emissions that comes out from those stacks, the key thing that people are interested in is that power is produced And the commercial value there is, of course, in the metering of the amount of energy that is produced. Nobody's really interested in the emissions coming out for the stack. Ditto for cement factory, ditto for oil and gas industries, where, of course, the key point there was oil initially, and now you see other things are happening. But the reports are coming, the reports on emissions are becoming more important because not just because of operational reasons, but now we're beginning to see that they are needed for global reasons and for local reasons. Otherwise, reports are such that they're scattered. Pick an example of what the industry I've just mentioned, I've cited, for example, in the power sector, where the gas that is being consumed are managed by those who are receiving the gas into the system, presuming we're talking about a gas power plant. And in the meters for electricity are seated somewhere else, and they're managed by people who are worried about the sales of the electricity. So there's no talking between the gas you bring it in and then the energy that is being produced, let alone discussing what are the emissions that come as a result of producing this electricity. But these are changing. The data are formally scattered, but gradually they are beginning to put together with the purpose of being able to account for the emissions that are generated as a result of producing those products. The very value that we are adding. If you go to the next slide, I've listed some examples of what has changed globally. And if you look at national, in the case of Climate Change Act, this is Nigeria, but that, of course, requires that we begin to report carbon. The G7 commitment, which is a global one, we have the energy transition plan that the country has put together, which implies that we need to be able to report every emissions within the energy sector, as an example. And you have the ISSB, which is the sustainability roadmap. Again, this also requires that you begin to adopt some sort of global reporting standards. The NDC, not only on the 3.0, of course, since Nigeria signed into the Paris Agreement, there is a need to begin to report emissions. And that, of course, changed the landscape of how emissions have been in the past with what you're beginning to see now. One of the key game changer within the product exports within the oil and gas is the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, now becoming some sort of a carbon tax that allows you as a country that exports product to be mindful of your emissions credentials. And if you're going to have your emission credentials, you are not going to likely put this together in a fragmented way. It needs to come together and then be able to report what carbon is accompanying that product that you are trading. If you go to the next slide. And what effect does that have on capital allocation? Again, as I said, I wouldn't want to spend so much time on this because we've already had some insight into this when Tosin was presented. But I think what I like to take from here is the fact that, you even want to go out there to raise finance or raise funds for projects. Now people are beginning to be interested to get into what kind of emission profile accompanies that production or that assets that you're having. We see that also in the TCFD, the ISSB. All these are sort of reporting in sustainability, in financial disclosure that comes along with also the carbon footprint from activities. This is changing the landscape, and this is mandating, in a way, how you do your reporting. You don't want to be caught in a point where you're trying to put this together and then you're struggling to get data A from one side, data B from another side, and trying to put these things together. I mean, there's a requirement based for all nations that exports oil product, like I mentioned on the CBAM, and then therefore there's a need to accompany it with emission profile. You won't do that with just getting fragments of data and trying to put that together. I tell you, I like to share a typical example of this. Before now, several years ago, visiting a facility that's going through some sort of verification of data from their facility. Because, like I said, it's not a normal practice. What people have back then was in their booklet. They wrote different things. And then they have another booklet where this is transferred into. And then from that second booklet, you have that being transferred into a computer. In the process of trying to move data from one to the other to the third one, the information you have in the third book on the computer is different from the second book and from the first book. And so it became so conflicting that you can't reconcile this information together. This is a verification exercise that's supposed to lead to some sort of being able to acquire carbon credits. But we were almost losing it because of our information, not because we were wrong, but just because someone who's written 43.04, for example, goes to the next book and has 43.40. And by the time you get to the third book, you're having 44.30. Three different data, not the same thing, but because of reconciliation, moving one to the other has become a challenge. And this is all what you have as a result of fragmented type of data that are being picked from one point to the other. And in the end, you end up getting it not right. You don't want to do that. You don't want that to happen, especially with the trend at which things are going, looking at the expected point at where we need to report. So if you go to the next slide, this is just let's just flip through just to show that there's an border adjustment mechanism, and this is transaction that started indeed this year. Next slide. When that information first came out, next slide, please. It's hard to know what this will be, but then of course the impact is on the energy producers, because you're checking credentials of your emissions, and this is all the efforts by the EU to ensure that they minimize or they reduce emissions from the products that is going into the country. And so it's important that this is looked into by the nations. And how then do you react to it? Next slide, please. How do you react to these things that are coming up? Today, we have emission management becoming consolidated and enterprise-wide governance issue. We're now having organizations trying to integrate their systems to manage emissions across operations. Emissions are not just at one stop. You don't need to move books from one point to the other. You only need to have to be able to key in through a centralized emission data management systems, and you need to have a kind of de facto MRV system within the operations where you're monitoring, reporting, and verifying all together within an integrated system that is put together. And with that, you can align all these activities with your climate targets. For example, in companies where the targets are set to reduce emissions at the beginning of the year. So you are able to monitor this in real time as to how emissions are going in within the facility and how you can reduce it. And again, it allows then the managers or the decision makers to be able to look at climate, the risk it protects and that it comes with, and also to be able to, particularly in places where prices are put on carbon. Some companies will put price on carbon. Emissions should not be more than this. If it does more than this, it's a liability, and they put price tag on it, and people within the system will be able to respect it. So now what you have in the ongoing situation is that things are getting integrated. albeit not much, but I think this is the direction, and this is something that is being done with softwares that are now much available. So before I stop, I like to be able to say here that for companies, this is very important. For institutions, for corporate institutions. So reporting in this sense, we're not talking about just facilities. We're talking about even institutions to be able to report emissions as the global practice requires. So let me stop here and see if there are questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. James. My name is Ibilola. I'm stepping in temporarily for Amina. I think she'll reconnect back in a minute. I will hand over now in the spirit of moving this quickly, and then so we can come back to the question and answer. I'll hand over now to, okay, Amina is back. All right, Amina, over to you.
Thank you. Apologies, I had a bit of a technical issue. If you live in Nigeria, I don't have to say what just happened. Thank you so much for that insightful session, Dr. James. I just wanted to sort of connect the two, Tosin's session and Dr. Ogunle's session. So I think what strikes me about what you've walked us through was that, or is that carbon credibility is not just a statement you make, right? It's something that you earn transaction by transaction, data set by data set. So what Tosin did in the beginning was to sort of show us the governance structure that needs to exist at the top. And then Dr. Ogunleye has now come in and shown us what it looks like to have operational integrity attached to that. So thank you so much for that. And I will hand over to Alexander, who is going to show us the connective tissue between it all, and that's the systems and architecture that makes it all defensible, scalable and real. So over to you, Alexander.
Thanks a lot, Amina. Let's just give a moment to the team to present it. Yeah, okay, perfect. So you said it perfectly, right? And we heard from Madame Tosin the importance of proper governance, and then from Dr. James we heard about the importance of having integrated systems, right? So what I'm going to present today fits very well there, and basically our subject will be architecture of Scope 3 intelligence, right? So the idea is that I would like to present to you some of the major challenges which are arising from basically reporting on Scope 3 emissions, how we design solutions around it, and yeah, before further ado, we can basically start. So Toby, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So I would like to start from basically discussing the Scope 3 challenges, right? For those who are not very much familiar with the Scope 3 emissions, we need to know that there is actually 15 Scope 3 categories, which is significantly large number. But luckily, most of the companies will only be reporting a subsection of it, right? Only the material ones. But what is also important to note is that we have 3 out of those 15 categories, which are basically requiring intensive engagement with the value chain stakeholders, right? Simply said, that means that you need to interact with your value chain stakeholders and basically send the requests or issue the requests to get some emissions data out of them, right? Also, I would like to state that for most of the companies, the Scope 3 emissions are typically ranging from 70 to 90%, right? So very high significance, right? And just to get a sense of the scale, when it comes to reporting Scope 3 emissions, typically any medium or large size company would have hundreds or thousands of suppliers and data points, which are basically there to be collected and reported, right? Next slide, please. So I would like us to actually have a reflection on the basic emission calculation scopes, right? And also what they represent and then what the current status of reporting on the scopes is, right? So we have the scope 1 emissions, which are basically direct emissions from owned operations. And most of the companies nowadays are on high readiness level when it comes to reporting and calculating these emissions. So we have labeled them as mature, right? Then we have the scope 2 emissions, which are basically indirect emissions from purchased energy. And they're also very well known and understood, right? So they are also labeled as mature. But when it comes to scope 3 emissions, a lot of companies are basically still exploring and are in so-called scaling stage, how we see it, right? So they have kind of started reporting on some, let's say, easier categories, right? But still trying to figure out the ways on how to scale it and actually collect all the data required to fully report on their scope 3 emissions, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so I want us to, we mentioned scalability, right? So I want us to understand what is the scalability wall, right? What is kind of standing in front of us and not making it that easy to report on the scope 3 emissions, right? So at this point, I would like to basically specify the purchase goods and services and capital goods as two categories, which are basically depending on collection of hundreds of supplier line items, right? So we depend on collecting carbon footprint data from our suppliers. So what that is the first and initial challenge, right? So we probably need to manually or using specific systems collect this data, right? Then the next challenge lies in the data quality itself, right? So as you would assume, vendors would send this data in a different formats, different units, etc., and all of this data would then represent the mixed data quality, which would need to be normalized at reporting company end, right? When it comes to investments as one of the scope 3 categories, first of all, we have to report on portfolio level, right? So why is that a challenge? The challenge is because usually these portfolios will be very much diversified, right? And not same methodologies could be applied across portfolios. And these different type of industries, which usually would be the investees and borrowers, would kind of report the emissions with different kind of data quality and unstandardized ways, right? So as well, we have the different asset classes, right? So we know that the bank products are ranging from mortgages to any type of loans, right? So the emissions would need to be aggregated on these asset classes properly and reported as such, right? And of course, the high reliance on the external data source, which is, I think, so far very clear, right? Then we have data and methodology gaps, right? So a lot of the times when we talk to our suppliers, vendors, or investees and borrowers, they will not be capable to basically provide the data, right? So it is important to note that still a lot of entities are not at a high level of emission readiness, and this still represents the burden for them. But we need to adopt the operational reality, and at this point, I mean, later on during my presentation, I'll show you how we can handle the situations where we have this missing primary data, right? So simply said, the suppliers are not capable of providing the data back to us, right? Then for that reason, we need to have the fallback estimation methodologies, right? And of course, the transparency requirements is growing as the regulatory pressure is increasing, right? So next slide. Okay. I mentioned a few times so far that data collection plays a big role when it comes to reporting scope 3 emissions. And I would like us to take a look at the current reality, right? So the reality is that we need to request data from hundreds or thousands stakeholders, right? You would imagine that those stakeholders are not very responsive when it comes to providing their emissions data, right? So in that case, we would probably need to chase the responses and handle different formats because they would probably respond in an unstructured way, right? So this data would need to be cleaned, validated, and normalized in order to be ready for reporting, right? Then I would like us to also reflect on the key pain points here, right? So the first one would be low response rate from suppliers. This is, I think, something which we observe at the moment and what is to be expected in a way. Then we have the inconsistent data formats and units. We have no fallback when the data is unavailable. That means in case the company relies fully on getting data from the vendors, investees, and borrowers, you may get trapped and not be able to meet your reporting requirements, right? So also the results are lacking methodological transparency, which means usually you won't be having a full picture on how your vendors and investees and borrowers have actually estimated their emissions, right? And of course, this process repeats every reporting cycle. So now these key pain points, we have to keep them in mind when thinking on designing solution around these problems, right? Next slide, please. So I would like us to also have a bit better understanding on methodology, right, when it comes to Scope 3 emissions. Specifically talking to the categories which are kind of depending on getting data from suppliers, investees, and borrowers, right? So here they're ordered by the accuracy, and we have as the highest accuracy, we have the supplier-specific data methodology, right? Which simply said means you need to interact with your value chain stakeholders and get the inputs from them, right? The inputs are basically the product carbon footprints or the actual emissions in their scope 1, 2, and 3, depending on the industry where they're coming from, right? So this methodology is the highest accuracy, and the reason for that is that the vendors themselves have actually engaged and estimated the emissions based on their operational reality, right? Then we have two fallback methodologies, which of course are taking second and third place. And the first one would be the spend-based estimation, right? So in case your value chain stakeholders are not ready to report back, you still need to find a way, figure out a way how to calculate the emissions, right? And that would be one of the ways would be using spend-based estimates, right? So the spend-based estimation can be done in a few ways. One way would be to actually get the spend-based emission factors from the value chain stakeholders, which means they are capable to estimate their emissions. But when it comes to allocating them to specific products, they're basically using revenue share generated by specific product category to allocate these emissions back to the products. And as a final result, you would basically get the emission factor, saying how much of kilogram CO2 equivalent per each dollar spent you can expect to emit for specific item, right? So then we have the industry average proxies, because sometimes you won't be able to find the spend-based emission factors. You need to then rely on the industry average proxies. And that basically means you're not going to use the product level emissions, but you're then aggregating your product spendings into sectors and then trying to find these high level empirically derived emission factors for the sector level and apply them, right? The drawback here is that they're of low accuracy because they may be derived on a very limited sample of the data and for some different kind of regions. But of course, if you don't have any other options, then this is something which a company should consider, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so now Madame Tosin also said, and I want to quote her, that regulatory convergence, right? So aside from regulatory convergence, which is happening, we strongly believe that there must be a solution convergence as well, right? So nowadays we have a lot of solutions, right? Ranging from basic spreadsheet calculations to specialized software, right? But in its nature, so far, they're all siloed calculation engines, right? they may be satisfying scope 1, 2, and 3, or any specific scopes and being specialized for specific industries. But if you think about it on a higher level, they are all basically our calculation engines, right? So in case you want to complete the whole process and exchange your data, verify your data, you still rely on manual data exchange, right? And then we have untransparent methodologies as one of the largest challenges of using various tools, right? So what we strongly believe is that all of these solutions, they need to converge into something which we name the emission data ecosystem, right? So the ecosystem is the new generation of digital solutions, which should be able to, first of all, not yet, just get back to, okay, thanks. Which should be able to, first of all, estimate the emissions, right? So the companies should be able to use the emission data ecosystem to input the data, estimate the emissions, store their emissions reliably in a structured way, right? So we have a single source of truth, and then also be able to verify the data directly on the emission data ecosystem, and then exchange the data across the system, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so I want us to now take a bit deeper look on what are those components which we think the emission data ecosystem needs to have, right? So the first one is we named it Connect, right? What we mean by Connect is that speaking about data collection in the scope 3 emissions, you usually don't expect this to be a one-time off exchange, right? You usually rely on long-term connections with your value chain stakeholders, right? So we believe that the emission data ecosystem needs to allow companies to sign up, register, and then link to investees, borrowers, value chain stakeholders in a term of long-term connection, right? So once they are connected and this link is created, then they should be able to estimate their emissions reliably, right? With the capability to use multiple methodologies, and also the system needs to be transparent. And when we say that the system needs to be transparent, we basically mean that the metadata of the calculations needs to be saved at any step and included in data exchange and also the emission reports, right? Then we have the exchange aspect of the data ecosystem, which means that the request for emission data could be sent out to the stakeholders, and also the companies would be able to share their own verified results upstream, right? Then we have the verification. We also see this new generation of emission data ecosystem having the third-party verifiers being able to join the platform and directly provide assurance and certification services on the platform, right? Next slide, please. So just want to have a quick summary of what this would unlock, right? So it would unlock the scalability, and in a sense that the whole process would be streamlined, right? So it would remove this manual overhead. Then the accuracy would be imposed in a sense that the primary data would be used wherever available, and then the transparent fallbacks would be used where we don't have the primary data coming from value chain stakeholders, right? All the assumptions metadata would need to be stored, right, and easily accessible. And then we have the standardized data exchange across the value chain ecosystem, right? Then we have the capability of meeting the regulatory requirements, and of course, tracking the methodological upgrades from, let's say, spend-based to supplier specific over time. So we have this continuous improvement moment on the ecosystem, and that would be clearly visible, right? So next slide, please. Okay, so I want to also reflect on the current shifts which are happening, right? So we've seen already a bit on previous presentations, but let's just take a look at it once again. So we're moving from voluntary disclosure to mandatory assured reporting, right? We are moving from estimated averages to verified primary data, and then from annual static reports to continuous data exchange. And I think I should just stop a bit right here and try to explain this a bit more. So far, the company's been basically working towards releasing the sustainability report once a year, right? And that report would more or less be static across the time. But now, since this scope 3 is about to become mandatory, you would probably get continuous requests to share your emission data over the time, and as well you would need to issue the requests over the time. So this is why we think that the annual static reports are moving to continuous data exchange, right? And then moving from untransparent methodologies to transparent calculations. So this is basically imposed by regulatory pressures. And I want to also take a look at the right side of the slide where we have the emerging standards and show you how the emerging standards are basically also evolving in this kind of direction. And that was also mentioned by Madame Tosin, that we are observing the regulatory convergence. And speaking to that, I want to touch base on what is happening in that space. So we have the Pathfinder network defining the standard for product level carbon footprint exchange across the value chains. So what they're actually working on is the standardized way of exchanging the emissions data between different parties, right? Then we all know about the GNG protocol. We are all in a way familiar with it. GNG protocol is partnering up with ISO to also harmonize a common global language for emission measurement, right? So not only the regulatory convergence, but we also have the methodological convergence happening in front of us, right? And then we have the assurance escalation, which basically means that limited assurance now is actually expected to be reasonable assurance by 2030, right? So thank you for your attention. And now I would yield the floor for your questions and back to, let me see if Amina is here or we.
I'm here. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Perfect. Back to you, Amina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And I think that what you've done is sort of given us the practical answer to the question that Tosin posed at the beginning. And connecting to say that if your data is weak, your governance is basically cosmetic, right? And you show us what it looks like to have sort of that strong data. Fun fact, just from Dr. James's conversation when he pulled up NDCs and energy transition plans, there's some people on this call in my team that have worked on both those things. So it's nice to see that, these works are being scaled or being used today. I'm going to move on to the Q&A session. We have about 20 minutes for that, and I'll just start asking some of the questions I've received to the speakers. So without further ado, I won't waste any time. The first question is to Tosin. And it says that one key issue raised is that emissions data often sits across multiple departments, so operations, finance, sustainability, and compliance. And the question is, what are the biggest risks organizations face when emissions data remains fragmented across silos?
Thank you very much, Amina, and thank you for the question for the person that asked. So you're right, that silo exists. And the biggest risk is that the information that would come through is not standardized, number one. So it's important that before you start collecting the information, you agree. So it's important that you have an owner from the onset. So where will the reporting converge? So is it going to sit in the sustainability team? And will it be in the risk department? So those conversations have to be had. Who will own the data? Who will then agree? So the owner will then agree with the dependencies that this is the data I need from you, and this is how the data should come to me. So ownership has to happen. And then the owner will then drive and bring together the integration of the data. Yes, the data will sit in various buckets, but it's important that ownership happens at the onset. And the owner will then drive what the data dictionary would look like. And then the data will then be put in the right context. So at the point of converging the data, it is coming together in a way that has been structured. So I agree the risk is there because it sits across various departments. And if it's not standardized from the get-go, you run the risk of getting something that you can't put together at the end of the day. Thank you, Amina.
Thank you. The next question is to Dr. James. So historically, emissions data was collected primarily for operation or regulatory purposes rather than strategic management. What triggered that shift from reactive emissions reporting to more structured carbon accounting practices?
Yeah, thank you very much, Amina. So, I mean, that's the good question. And of course, the real driver for that is the global impact of, I mean, speaking of emissions, from emission standpoint, it's about the global impact of climate change, where a lot of treaties, a lot of sort of agreements, such as what you call the Paris Agreement, that requires that everybody starts reporting. You know, we were not even settled with the Paris Agreement when there was a demand also for energy transition. And for example, a country like Nigeria, we signed into all these things with the idea that we want to be proactive without even, I mean, looking at our data. But so it places that need on us to shift from just operational reasons, but for obligation purposes, and also for us to be able to, I mean, now the last layer on top of it is that you now need all this data even for business purpose. You can't even get your product out into the international market without being able to show credentials for what your what your emissions look like. So it's now something that's of global concern as opposed to local issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a question in the Q&A box from Obi. You didn't direct it to anyone in particular, but the question is, I'll allow any of the speakers to take it. It says, as of now, would most big corporates find it more expensive to be taxed by regulators or invest in accurate and comprehensive data?
Okay, so the question is, would organization find it expensive to be taxed? Okay,
By
so
regulators.
by regulators. So the Nigeria recently released the carbon market framework. So whether we like it or not, taxation is going to follow eventually. And so it's important that we realize that taxation is also a tool that the government would use to drive compliance. So yes, that expense would come. And if we don't get ready and even have a baseline for what your emissions are, how then can you put in a strategy to reduce your emissions and then avoid the tax that would come if you then exceed the limits that have been put in place by the government? So the answer to that question is yes, organizations would eventually have to face the tax conversation. The framework is already in place, and taxation would definitely follow at the end of the day. So to avoid that cost, it's important that organizations position properly because the tax expense is going to come. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I agree fully with that. You know, it's also about looking at taking some preemptive actions. You know, sometimes when you look at your industry, and you see what's happening in the environment, you want to start or go ahead of the curve so that you can even be a pioneer in whatever industry that you're in. Okay, there's another question. So many thanks to all the speakers. Who should be the custodian of the emissions data, given that we have various data points across the EMP upstream operation supply chain? How can we integrate all this data to obtain a representative set for business decision making?
Well, in terms of data for Nigeria, it's clear. If it has to do with emissions, the custodians are the National Council on Climate Change. They are the custodians. Regardless of the sector you are, I mean, they eventually, once it's emissions data, they cascade them into what they then receive. But beyond that is also that each sector also have some sort of data repository. Some people who are responsible for oil and gas, for example, in the upstream is the upstream regulator. For the mid and downstream is the mid and downstream regulator. So something like that in different institutions. But ultimately, whatever relates to emissions goes to National Council on Climate Change.
I mean, if I may add, in addition to what Dr. James has said, from the organization's perspective, I believe it's important that you have what I would term like the Chief Sustainability Officer, who will then be able to craft the strategy for the organization and then enable the strategy drive how the organization will collect its emissions data. So if I would need emissions data in any organization, I would ask for the Chief Sustainability Officer of the organization, and I would direct my inquiries around the information I need. So for us as stakeholders, it's important that organizations craft their sustainability strategy and have that person as the owner of the emissions data for the organization. That's my addition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. These are very robust answers to the questions and very insightful. So this question is to Alex. One of it says, what architectural approach is required to move from spend-based estimation models towards verified supplier-specific emissions data at scale? This was in response to, I think in your presentation, you had said that Scope 3 emissions often represent 70 to 90% of an organization's total footprint, and yet they remain the most difficult to measure due to fragmented supplier data and inconsistent methodologies.
Yes, thanks for the question. So basically, I mean, I think that it comes down to value chain stakeholders' readiness, right? So as I said, usually we would all seek to have these primary data collected, but the operational reality is that our value chain stakeholders will probably not be ready, or most of them won't be ready, right? So we need to fall back to spend-based methodology, but the basic principles when it comes to carbon accounting are saying to us that we should always try to improve the accuracy, right? So the moment when we have the high readiness of emission readiness of our value chain stakeholders, we can move to higher accuracy methodology as supplier-specific methodology, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
This question. Sorry, are you done?
Yes, back to you, Amina.
Okay, thank you. So this question is to both Dr. James and Tosin. It says strong emissions governance is increasingly linked to access to finance and long-term resilience. In what ways can organizations leverage emissions intelligence as a competitive advantage rather than simply a compliance requirement?
Okay, thank you. And I would use my experience in my current role. So we currently we've baselined our emissions, and what we are trying to put on that layer is then utilizing the information we get from our stakeholders to drive engagement with the stakeholders. So it's important that it's not just a compliance conversation. How then can you layer on the information you get to drive engagement, to generate more business interaction, So taking it away from the compliance conversation, you have the data that you've gotten from the stakeholders. How then do you lay on that? Okay, this customer is giving me this emissions information. How can I co-create emissions reduction solution? How can I finance emissions reductions requirements that this customer requires? Then it moves away from the compliance conversation and it becomes more of an advantage. And you then start talking a symbiotic relationship of the data you have gotten from the stakeholders. So that's how I am experiencing the conversation and moving it away from a compliance conversation into something that is more symbiotic and more of a competitive advantage conversation. Thank you.
Just adding a little bit to what Tosi had said, because I think she's gotten it all right. And that is not far from what I wanted to add. The only thing I wanted to say is that, some industries where you ensure that you have emissions, apart from setting up a sustainability desk, having someone who is responsible, like Tosi had said, whosoever is responsible can also sort of internally look at what was the emissions profile last year, meaning that you have an inventory that you have been able to put together. And you can say to yourself that if we are, say, for example, 25,000 tons of emission, what's driving that? Knowing those sources and then beginning to think inwardly, what can we do to drive this down? Some institutions will even go ahead and put a price on carbon, such that they begin to see that as a liability. And then you stand yourself very competitive, because when you are comparing yourself with similar industry and then you put in an index to it that this is your emissions intensity, then it makes you to stand tall compared to other people. But you must have to do that internally. There have to be a sustainability team who is looking at what are the drivers of these emissions and what can you do to reduce it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just making sure, I'm looking at the time to make sure we have, please team, just notify me when we're running out. I have another question for Dr. Ogunleye. This says methane intensity and fugitive emissions are areas where data credibility is notoriously difficult, especially in joint venture structures. What does a defensible MRV framework actually look like in that context?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's really slightly difficult, but shouldn't be if the protocols are quite clear. So, for example, if you're using a certain protocol, say, for example, the World Research Institute protocol, which allows you to be able to determine emissions based on who is the operator and who is also like a co-owner, for example, as the case in the joint venture situation. So if you allocate those emissions, a profile has to be first established. What's the inventory of the emissions? And then, of course, in a JV's role, you have to share it if it's by what Nigeria commonly have, which is 60-40, 60 in favor of the government, 40 as the operator. And then you have to share those emissions in that manner. That then implies that there has to be a high level of transparency when those data are being collected. You talked about fugitive methane. Fugitive methane emissions are very notorious in that even if you take measurements now, the readings aren't going to be the same. Even if you check it the following day, they are moved by a lot of factors, temperature, pressure, inclusive. So that implies that you need to be able to agree as to how many times you want to do this checking in a year, and then be able to take an average of what you think these data are. But nevertheless, in terms of split, it has to be in such a way that you're using a particular protocol. It could be WR, it could be any other thing, but whatever you are using, it must be comfortable with the partners, so that each party is not looking as though this is not transparent enough. So that aspect of even getting the inventory done, it must be transparently done and jointly agreed on who's doing it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We have one more question. We have time for just one question. So, what differentiates providers in the market who aim to track and strengthen emissions governance? That's consultants versus software versus a combination of other approaches. This is posed to all the speakers.
Can you repeat
Do
the
you want to take
question
that?
again?
Yeah, can you take it again, please? Yeah.
Okay. What differentiates providers in the market who aim to track and strengthen emissions governance? So, and then in brackets, it's consultants versus software versus a combination or other approaches.
Okay, if I may start, I think having a strategy is very important. Before you set out on differentiating yourself, how do you want to win? It's important you have a strategy. So I think the differentiator is having the right plan in place and make sure it's dynamic. So it evolves with the evolving environment. So compliance is what has brought us here. So the regulator is increasingly pointing our eyes in the direction of reporting appropriately. But what will then take us to the next level is turning that compliance conversation into how you would win. So what will then differentiate you? You will need consultants to go with you on this journey. So it's important that if you have the right strategy, you then can bring on the right consultants to help you win. But having the right strategy, I feel it's the starting point. I would allow Dr. James and Alex to add on to the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think from my end, what I would just say, in addition to what Tosin said, is that on top of strategy is the fact that you then also have to ensure that you do not rely just on one thing. Recall that software is what software does for you is to ensure that nothing is missing, and then you are able to troubleshoot areas where things are wrong. For example, software will enable you to be able to tell you that your emission seems to be going higher or is going lower, and then be able to give you some indicators that you are able to check whether data helping you to troubleshoot where data is wrong. But I think ultimately what you need to be able to do is to be able to combine the use of software with every other tool that is important to be able to monitor emissions. So you don't rely on one. I mean, you have to combine things together.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers for answering all our questions and to our participants who asked these very important questions. I hope that, we can take these away and reflect. So we're coming to the end of this session, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to to reflect before we formally closed on, everything that we've heard today. Just to bring it all in together, Tosin opened us up with that deceptively simple question: who owns emissions in your organization? I think that is something that's going to stick with me beyond organizations, that I will reflect a lot on that question, and I hope you do too. And then she also showed us what happens when the answer is not clear, when things are fragmented, that data is fragmented, and there's siloed decisions, the risks gaps that the regulators and the lenders will find before you do, because of that fragmentation. So most organizations in this room are somewhere between stage 1 and 3, and the goal is to get to stage 4 and 5. And the question is whether there is the executive will in your organizations to close that gap. Now, so Dr. Ogunleye brought us face to face with what it costs to get it wrong operationally, in methane intensity, the complexities of JVs, gaps between what is declared and what can be verified. He reminded us that, Africa's carbon story is not just a footnote to the global conversation. it is central to that conversation. And the institutions and operators who treat it that way will be the ones that are ahead. And finally, Alexander gave us that architecture, like I said, the muscle, the bridge between it all. That architecture is not just aspirational, but as the engineering, the source systems, the methodology, the audit trails. And he showed us that dashboards are not just cosmetic, but they are also functional. He showed us the distance between spreadsheets to institutional grade infrastructure. It requires intent and not tools. Thank you so much to our speakers. And if I had to distill one sentence today, for me, it would be the one that Tosin closed with, not just because her presentation was catchy. I think everybody else's was just as important, um, you know, but something stood out to me as well, and it's that it's not just about sustainability maturity, it's about the financial system readiness as well. Thank you so much. And that's what today has been about. And I hope everyone in this room leaves with something specific that they intend to do differently. And on behalf of MudoZangl, I want to sincerely thank the speakers for taking the time out of their schedules to hold these sessions with us. Tosin, Dr. James, Alexander, for your time, your depth of knowledge that you've shared with us and bringing real substance to a conversation that deserves it. Thank you all for joining the third episode of this deep dive series. I hope we see you again, and follow MudoZangl's channels for resources from today. I believe they'll be shared, and details of upcoming sessions will also be. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Thank you. The slides, I believe, will be shared. Just to ask my team. I believe we'll share it on the MudoZangl channel. So please just follow, and you'll get I think the recording from the session will be there as well. Okay. Bye, everyone.